In the mid-19th century, Minnesota was still a young frontier of the United States. Along the upper reaches of the Mississippi River, St. Paul was then only a small town rising out of the mud, with rough wooden saloons and hastily built general stores, streets that turned to mire with the seasons, and a population made up largely of newly arrived European immigrants who came and went in quick succession. Mary Ann Evarts Wright, known in St. Paul as Anne Bilansky, was one of these women. She grew up without the security that a stable household can provide, and her first husband died in a railroad accident, leaving her with little money and even less support. By the late 1850s, she joined the northward flow of migrants and came to St. Paul, carrying with her the past of a poor widow and a fragile hope for a new beginning. No one in that small river town could have foreseen that this almost anonymous woman would become the central figure in a deeply contested case of husband poisoning, and the only woman in Minnesota's history to be led to the gallows by order of a court. Mary Ann Evarts Wright, who would later be known in Minnesota simply as Anne Bilansky, was born around 1820 in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Surviving records of her early life are sparse. They do not preserve details of her childhood, education, or family circumstances beyond the basic fact of her birthplace. What is known is that, as a young woman, she married and resided for some years in North Carolina with her first husband, whose name the surviving sources do not consistently record. That first marriage ended abruptly when he was killed in a railroad accident, leaving her a widow at an early age. Following this loss, Mary Ann joined the flow of internal migrants moving through the Mississippi Valley in the 1850s. She relocated first to Pleasant Hill, Illinois, and then farther north. Her movements during these years appear to have been driven less by settled plans than by necessity and family obligation. In April 1858, she traveled to St. Paul at the request of a relative, John Walker, who was reportedly ill with typhoid fever and in need of assistance. The precise nature of their kinship is not entirely clear in the surviving documents. He is often described as her nephew, but the relationship was close enough that she left her previous residence and undertook the journey to help manage his household. St. Paul at that time offered limited security for a middle-aged widow without substantial property. Employment opportunities for women were generally confined to domestic service, boarding house work, or informal labor within family enterprises. Within months of her arrival, Mary Ann entered into a new marriage with Stanislaus, often rendered Stanislaus or Stanislas, Bilansky, a Polish immigrant who had come to St. Paul from Wisconsin in 1848. He kept a small cabin on what was then Stillwater Road, later East 7th Street, which served both as a family dwelling and as a modest saloon and grocery. By all contemporary accounts, Stanislaus was not a prosperous man. He drank heavily and was frequently described as sullen or difficult in manner. His second wife, Ellen, had divorced him in 1856 after roughly 9 years of marriage, leaving him with custody of their surviving children, Benjamin, Rinaldo, and Kate, all still young at the time. When Mary Ann married him in September 1858, she brought no children of her own into the union but assumed responsibility for the day-to-day care of his 3. Witnesses would later testify that she quickly settled into the management of the household and the care of the children, dividing her efforts between domestic work and assisting as she could with the small business that supported them. The household's financial position remained precarious. The combined dwelling, saloon, and grocery consisted of a small main room, an attached cellar, and a rough outbuilding to the rear, far from the substantial homes of St. Paul's established merchants. Income depended on irregular trade, and periods of ill health on Stanislaus's part could quickly disrupt what little stability they had. For a woman already twice uprooted by circumstance, the marriage offered shelter but not security. It was within this narrow and uncertain space, between obligation to her new family and dependence on a husband of fragile means and habits, that Mary Ann Everard's Wright, now commonly called Anne Bilansky, began the brief final chapter of her life in St. Paul. By the turn of 1859, the small Bilansky household on Stillwater Road had settled into a routine that combined hard work with continual strain. The cabin functioned as both home and place of business, with a bar and grocery counter in one part of the main room and the family's living space arranged around it. Stanislaus's health had long been uncertain, and acquaintances later described periods of melancholy and physical weakness that interrupted his work and contributed to the family's financial difficulties. In late February 1859, a seemingly mundane errand would later assume great importance. While running errands with her neighbour Lucinda Kilpatrick, Anne stopped at a St. Paul drugstore and purchased a small quantity of arsenic, paying 10 cents for a jar. She stated at the time that the poison was needed to deal with rats that had been damaging vegetables stored in the cellar. Kilpatrick, by her own account, accepted this explanation and did not immediately regard the purchase as suspicious. The presence of rodents in such establishments was common, and arsenic-based preparations were widely used as vermin control. Around the same period, Stanislaus began to complain of illness. According to later testimony, he suffered first from what appeared to be an ordinary stomach ailment. By early March, specifically between the 6th and the 11th, his condition had worsened, and family members observed symptoms that included gastric distress, vomiting, and fever. Neighbors would later recall that the illness was initially attributed to indigestion or to the combined effects of drink and patent medicine. Stanislaus continued to consume alcohol and so-called Grafenberg or Grafenberg pills, a popular proprietary remedy of the era, even as his strength declined. A physician did visit the house during this period and, according to his later statement, did not at first regard the case as immediately life-threatening. The impression, shared by several who saw Stanislaus in the early stages of his illness, was that he was suffering a severe but not extraordinary attack of gastric disorder, of the kind not uncommon in a setting where alcohol, irregular meals, and physical strain were part of daily life. As the days passed, however, his condition deteriorated. Witnesses later recounted that Anne kept close to his bedside, tending to him and to the children. On at least one occasion, she was seen in tears, asking what would become of the children if anything happened to their father. The remark, remembered by those present as an expression of anxiety, would acquire a different resonance when it was repeated in court months later. On March 11, 1859, the illness reached its final stage. That day, Stanislaus called for liquor from the bar and drank a glass while confined to his bed. Within a short time, variously described in the sources as within half an hour, he collapsed and died. His age was generally given as 52. For the family and neighbors, the death, though distressing, seemed at first to be the culmination of a known pattern of ill health, heavy drinking, and recent fever. Local authorities were notified, and a coroner's jury viewed the body. After hearing brief testimony and considering the doctor's impressions, the jury concluded that the death was due to natural causes. Stanislaus was buried the following day. With that, it appeared that the matter would pass into the category of private misfortune, one more early grave in a community accustomed to the risks of frontier life. It would only be in the hours and days that followed, when earlier events were reconsidered and additional statements were made, that the circumstances of his last illness would be drawn back into public view and reinterpreted as the possible traces of a crime. Suspicion first attached itself to Stanislaus Bilansky's death within hours of his burial. On the afternoon of March 12, 1859, as the funeral procession was preparing to leave the Bilansky home, officials from the Ramsey County Coroner's Office arrived and halted the departure. They conducted a brief search of the premises, examined the body, and convened a hastily assembled coroner's jury, hearing testimony from John Walker, neighbor Lucinda Kilpatrick, housekeeper Rosa Scharf, often rendered Scharf or Scharf, and others who had been present during the final illness. all swore that they had seen nothing overtly suspicious. The jury concluded that Stanislaus had died of natural causes, although a local newspaper noted criticism of Anne for what was termed a want of care, particularly her failure to recall the physician as his condition worsened. Stanislaus was buried that evening. That same night, events took a different turn. Kilpatrick, reflecting on her earlier testimony, realized that she had omitted a detail she now regarded as potentially important: the purchase of arsenic on February 28th. At the urging of her husband, Andrew, she went to St. Paul's Chief of Police, John W. Crosby, and reported that 2 weeks before the death, she had accompanied Anne uptown, where Anne had bought arsenic at a drugstore. According to Kilpatrick, Anne had said that her husband wanted the poison to kill rats in the cellar, which had become a problem after the family cat was given away. Arsenic, sold in small quantities as a vermin killer, was not uncommon in mid-19th century households, but the coincidence of the purchase and the recent death now appeared less benign. On the basis of Kilpatrick's revised statement, authorities ordered Stanislaus's body exhumed the next morning. A medical team assembled to perform a post-mortem examination, and both Anne and John Walker were taken into custody, while a second coroner's inquest was prepared. The second jury convened on March 15th. This time, Kilpatrick and Scharf offered more detailed testimony, and preliminary scientific evidence was presented regarding the contents of the stomach and internal organs. At this second inquest, the emerging case against Anne took clearer form. Kilpatrick repeated her account of the February 28th shopping trip, now adding remarks she said Anne had made at the drugstores and afterwards. When a druggist at one store offered a more expensive preparation instead of ordinary arsenic powder, Anne, short of money, declined and later purchased 10 cents worth of arsenic, a white powder in a small jar, from the firm of Day & Jenks. Kilpatrick stated that Anne had remarked she would not mind giving him a pill if the doctor was not attending him, and that if her husband should drop away sudden, the authorities might suspect her. After the death, Kilpatrick said, Anne had tried to persuade her to swear that she, not Anne, had purchased the arsenic. According to Kilpatrick, she refused, replying that if no arsenic were found in the stomach, they can do nothing with you, to which Anne allegedly responded by suggesting that her husband might have taken it himself. Rosa Scharf, who had been hired on March 2nd to assist in the household during Stanislaus's illness, provided a different kind of testimony. Her statements at the inquest, and later at trial, focused on the domestic arrangements within the house. She described the pattern of meals prepared for the family, noted that Stanislaus's food was sometimes kept separate from that of the others, and remarked on what she perceived as Anne's failure to treat her husband as I think a husband should be treated. To Scharf, these details suggested a troubled marriage and an emotional distance between husband and wife. Investigators, hearing this alongside Kilpatrick's account, began to see a possible convergence of motive, means, and opportunity. The most technically complex evidence came from the post-mortem examination. Druggist W.H. Wolfe and physician J.C. Goodrich testified regarding the tests they had performed on samples taken from the body. Wolfe reported that one of the chemical procedures had produced a single crystal which, viewed under the microscope, resembled arsenic. Goodrich, however, was notably cautious. His testimony, as later summarized by a local newspaper, was described as guarded and non-committal, and he declined to state positively that the stomach contents demonstrated poisoning. The methods available at the time were limited, and neither man claimed to have carried out a complete quantitative analysis. Despite the ambiguity in the scientific testimony, the second coroner's jury reached a markedly different conclusion from the first. Taking together Kilpatrick's new statements about the arsenic purchase and alleged remarks, Scharf's account of household tensions and separate meals, and Wolfe's report of a crystal resembling arsenic, the jury found that Stanislaus Bilansky had died from arsenic poisoning, A grand jury subsequently adopted this view and returned an indictment charging Anne Bilansky with the murder of her husband. District Court Judge Edward C. Palmer set the trial for late May 1859, and Anne, through counsel, entered a plea of not guilty. John Walker, who had initially been arrested alongside her, was not indicted and was released, though his relationship to the household remained a subject of interest to both investigators and the public. By the time the case reached the criminal docket, a coherent prosecutorial narrative had begun to take shape, even before formal opening statements were made. In that narrative, Anne's February purchase of arsenic provided the means. Her troubled marriage and alleged improper relationship with Walker supplied the motive, and the circumstances of Stanislaus's final illness, including separate food and her presence at his bedside, constituted the opportunity. Each of these elements rested heavily on the recollections and interpretations of neighbors and a housekeeper, and on scientific evidence that even contemporary observers acknowledged was far from conclusive. Nevertheless, in the spring of 1859, these strands were woven together into a case that the state of Minnesota was prepared to bring before a jury. When the case of State of Minnesota versus Anne Bilansky was called for trial on May 23, 1859, it did so in the Ramsey County Courthouse at St. Paul before District Court Judge Edward C. Palmer. The prosecution was led by County Attorney Isaac Hurd. The defense was undertaken by John Ball Brisbane, an experienced St. Paul lawyer. An all-male jury was empaneled to hear the evidence. The formal charge alleged that on or about March 11, 1859, Anne had willfully and with malice aforethought caused the death of her husband, Stanislaus Bilansky, by administering arsenic. Hurd's presentation of the case rested on three interconnected propositions: means, motive, and opportunity. First, he emphasized that Anne had purchased powdered arsenic on February the 28th, less than 2 weeks before the fatal illness, and that arsenic was a known and efficient poison. Second, he argued that she possessed a motive in the form of an alleged liaison, or desire for a liaison, with John Walker, the relative who lived in the small rear shanty on the Bilansky property. Third, he maintained that the domestic arrangements in the house, particularly the manner in which food was prepared and served, afforded her the opportunity to administer poison to her husband without exposing others to the same risk. The state's principal witnesses were neighbors and members of the household. Lucinda Kilpatrick recounted in detail the February 28th errand, describing how Anne had declined a more expensive preparation at one store and then purchased 10 cents worth of ordinary arsenic powder at Day and Jenks. Kilpatrick repeated the remarks she said Anne had made about her husband dropping away sudden, and about her own potential suspicion if he were to die unexpectedly. She also told the jury that after Stanislaus's death, Anne had tried to persuade her to say that she, rather than Anne, had purchased the arsenic, an attempt Kilpatrick portrayed as an effort to obstruct the investigation. Rosa Scharf, the young woman hired to assist in the household during the final illness, testified next. She described the internal life of the house, the separate preparation of Stanislaus's meals, the use of distinct dishes and utensils for his food, and what she regarded as Anne's failure to treat her husband in a manner befitting a wife. Her testimony suggested a marriage marked by tension and by what contemporaries might have called want of marital affection. Both Scharf and Kilpatrick stated that they believed Anne's relationship with John Walker to be improper, though their knowledge of that relationship consisted largely of impressions and inferences rather than direct observation. The state also called medical witnesses to support its theory of poisoning. Druggist W.H. Wolfe described the post-mortem tests he had conducted on the contents of Stanislaus's stomach and internal organs, including a procedure that yielded a single crystal which, under a microscope, resembled arsenic. Physician J.C. Goodrich, who had participated in the examination, offered more cautious testimony and declined to state categorically that arsenic was present. Nevertheless, the prosecution urged the jury to view the scientific evidence not in isolation, but in conjunction with the purchase of arsenic, the timing of the illness, and the domestic circumstances attested by the lay witnesses. Brisbane's defence was, by contemporary accounts, skillful and vigorous. He did not attempt to deny the purchase of arsenic, which was well attested, but argued that it had an innocent explanation. The cellars and store were rat-infested, and arsenic was a common remedy for such vermin. He stressed that Anne had openly conducted the purchase in the company of a neighbour, hardly the behaviour of one bent on secret murder. On the question of motive, he challenged the notion of a settled adulterous relationship with Walker, pointing out that the evidence of any such liaison was slender and speculative and rested on gossip rather than on concrete acts. On the scientific evidence, Brisbane sought to create reasonable doubt. He underscored the limitations of the examinations performed, the absence of a full chemical analysis, and the reluctance of Dr. Goodrich to endorse a definite finding of poisoning. The defence presented its own expert, who offered a contrary interpretation of the post-mortem findings and questioned whether the symptoms described by witnesses could be confidently attributed to arsenic rather than to natural gastric illness compounded by alcohol and patent medicines. Brisbane also reminded the jury of Stanislaus's long history of poor health and melancholy, suggesting that self-administration of poison could not be excluded on the record before them. After counsel for both sides had made their closing arguments, Judge Palmer instructed the jurors on the law of first-degree murder and on their duty to weigh the credibility of witnesses. He reminded them that they were to decide not on the basis of rumour or sentiment, but according to the evidence presented in court. On June 3, 1859, after fewer than 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom and, through its foreman, announced a verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree. Contemporary accounts reported that Anne listened to the verdict without visible emotion. Brisbane immediately moved for a new trial, arguing that the verdict was contrary to the weight of the evidence and that errors had been made in the admission and exclusion of testimony, particularly in limitations placed on his cross-examination of key witnesses. Judge Palmer denied the motion. The case was then carried to the Minnesota Supreme Court on narrow technical grounds, including challenges to certain rulings made during the trial. In July 1859, the High Court declined to disturb the conviction, holding that no reversible error had been shown. With that decision, the ordinary judicial avenues were exhausted. Formal sentencing followed months later. On December 2, 1859, Anne was brought again before Judge Palmer. Asked whether she had anything to say before sentence was pronounced, she declared that if she were to die in connection with the case, she would die an innocent woman, and that she did not believe she had received a fair and just trial. The court then imposed the mandatory penalty prescribed by law, 1 month's solitary confinement, to be followed by death by hanging at a date to be fixed by the executive. With the stroke of the judge's pen, the case passed from the control of the courts to that of the state's political and administrative authorities, setting the stage for the further developments and controversies that would follow. After the Minnesota Supreme Court declined to disturb the conviction, Anne Bilansky's case shifted from the courtroom to the jail, the governor's office, and the state legislature. In July 1859, while awaiting formal sentencing in the Ramsey County Jail, she escaped through an unsecured window, made her way toward the rural area around Lake Como and St. Anthony, and spent roughly a week at large. When she was recaptured in the company of John Walker, public curiosity about the case only deepened, and the escape was widely reported as further proof of her notoriety. Formal sentence was pronounced on December 2nd, 1859, 1 month in solitary confinement, followed by death by hanging. Under Minnesota's constitution, the governor held sole power to fix the execution date or commute the sentence. Governor Henry Sibley, then nearing the end of his term, declined to exercise either option. He neither set a date nor granted clemency, allowing the unresolved question of execution to pass to his successor. In the months that followed, efforts to secure mercy multiplied. Citizens submitted petitions urging commutation of the sentence, some condemning capital punishment in general and others focusing on the prospect of executing a woman. Former Territorial Governor Willis A. Gorman, now acting as one of Anne's lawyers, prepared a detailed petition cataloguing alleged irregularities at trial, including the limited scientific proof of poisoning and the influence of press coverage on public opinion. Minnesota Supreme Court Chief Justice Charles Flandreau wrote privately to the new governor, Alexander Ramsey, to express his opposition to the hanging of a woman. Most strikingly, County Attorney Isaac Hurd, who had prosecuted the case, informed Ramsey that he harbored grave and serious doubts as to whether Anne had received a fair trial. The legislature also took up the matter. In January 1860, a bill to prohibit the execution of women was introduced but tabled. On January the 25th, Ramsey fixed March 23, 1860, as the date of execution. In early March, lawmakers passed another measure declaring that Minnesota's first state execution should not be that of a woman and asserting that Anne's trial had been unfair, but Ramsey vetoed it on March 8th. By mid-March 1860, the judicial appeals had been exhausted, the petitions denied, and the legislative initiatives blocked. Despite the doubts expressed by prominent legal and political figures, the death sentence remained in force, and the authorities in St. Paul proceeded with preparations for the first state execution to be carried out under Minnesota's new institutions. On March 23, 1860, a crowd gathered in St. Paul to witness what would become the first and only judicial execution of a woman in Minnesota. Within the jail, Anne Bilansky was prepared for the gallows in accordance with the formalities prescribed by law. She walked to the scaffold under guard in the presence of local officials, clergy, and selected observers. Contemporary reports described her demeanor as composed and self-possessed, consistent with the quiet steadiness noted throughout her confinement. Before the sentence was carried out, she was given the customary opportunity to speak. She reiterated what she had told the court months earlier, that she would die an innocent woman, and that she did not believe she had received a fair and just trial. In some accounts, she added that she was a guilty woman, but not of this murder, and that she died as a victim of the law rather than of her own crime. With the completion of the execution, the legal record of State L. Bilansky formally closed. Yet the case has remained a subject of debate. The equivocal scientific evidence, the weight placed on rumor and implication, and the readiness of a new state to make an example of a woman all continue to trouble historians and legal scholars. Was Anne Bilansky a calculating poisoner who escaped no more than the just consequence of her acts, or a vulnerable woman judged as much by gendered expectations and public clamor as by proof? Do you regard the verdict and sentence as a defensible application of the law of the time, or as an early instance of capital punishment imposed under conditions that fell short of true fairness?